Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling cultural crossroads. These fascinating points where different cultures meet, sometimes clash and, blend.
Right. Think of it like less a map of just land and more a kind of cultural GPS.
Hmm.
It helps us understand how beliefs, perceptions, even senses sort of intersect.
Exactly. We're trying to navigate these, let's say, cultural cross-sections from different places.
And what's really key, according to our sources, are two main things for understanding these crossroads. First, you look at significant places that really represent wider cultural traits.
Okay, like a focal point.
Yeah, precisely. Locations that tell a bigger story. And second, you look for the perceptual differences within those traits. How do different groups actually experience things? Color, sound, time. It can be quite distinct.
That's fascinating. So today we're going to explore these intersections using lots of different angles, all from our source material. Personal stories, expat lives, migrant journeys.
Travelers' accounts too, globalization's impact, language, customs, the whole lot.
Yeah, and we're aiming to pull out the key insights, sort of give you a shortcut to understanding these really complex dynamics. Okay, should we jump in with some individual stories?
Let's do it. A really compelling example of navigating these divides comes from Katrina's story. She grew up in the U.S., but with Vietnamese roots.
Okay.
Her father was a U.S.-trained pilot in South Vietnam, quite a background, and her mother's journey to the U.S. after Saigon fell. Well, it was incredibly difficult.
Wow.
But what's striking is, even though they spoke Vietnamese at home, Katrina often felt like an outsider at family events.
That feeling of being caught between two worlds, isn't it?
Exactly. Even with the language, the cultural disconnect was there.
Mm.
Criticisms about Western habits, especially food, the fast food versus traditional meals thing.
Right, that really highlights it.
And Katrina wanted deeper talks, wanted her non-Vietnamese friends and family included. It just shows how complex cultural identity can be, even inside a family.
Yeah, it's not always straightforward. Katrina's story really gives us a personal window into those challenges. Now, you mentioned expats in Hong Kong. Our sources apparently show quite a range of experiences there.
Oh, absolutely. A real spectrum. You've got Alex, who arrived basically unprepared. Major culture shock.
Right.
Felt overwhelmed by the city, the scale of it, didn't feel safe at night. His story is kind of a cautionary tale about doing your homework before you move.
Yeah, you need some prep. But then there's Neo.
Right. Neo felt much more prepared. He lived in Singapore, done research Hong Kong movies, language, customs. He was initially really excited.
Okay, sounds promising.
But even with an expat social network, he ended up feeling bored and lonely later on.
So preparation isn't everything then. What does that tell us?
Well, it tells us that adaptation isn't, a simple formula. Prep helps, sure, but individual expectations, the place itself, even how you approach learning, it's all part of the mix, often unpredictable.
Okay. And there were others, Ellie and Sue.
Yeah, they took a different tack. They deliberately did minimal research, they'd lived abroad before, and actually enjoyed the process of discovering a new culture on the fly.
Interesting. And what was their take on Hong Kong?
They were surprised it felt so much like a microcosm of the Western world. A completely different perspective again.
It really is. But even they had some sharp observations, right? Ellie's comment about Westerners finding it hard to understand local Chinese work teams.
Oh, that quote, like trying to read round characters with a straight edge. So vivid.
It really is. And her idea that feeling grown up feels quite Western. That's a fascinating thought in itself.
It is. And we also see Neo's view of the city evolving. At first it felt unfamiliar, even with maps. But later he found its curves gripping in a rural sense. Suggests a deeper connection forming over time, perhaps.
Maybe. It sounds like there are also some disappointments, though.
Yeah, definitely. Hugo felt that journalism from outsiders wasn't really valued. And Carrie felt the local view of history was, twisted.
So navigating not just daily life, but also professional stuff, historical narratives, adds another layer of complexity.
Absolutely. And these individual issues seem to point to a broader feeling, our source notes. Uncertainty, vulnerability among expats there. But interestingly, feeling included, feeling part of something, seemed to really boost their confidence.
Right, that sense of belonging making a difference in how they were seen and how they felt. Okay, let's shift focus a bit to migrants' journeys. These often involve an even deeper identity shift, don't they? Rustam Kozane's story sounds powerful.
It really is. Migrated because of apartheid, basically reinvented himself in Zambia as a Zambian Muslim poet, then comes back to Cape Town with this unique voice, totally shaped by those experiences.
Wow, that's quite a transformation.
It really embodies that idea of fundamentally reshaping yourself in response to new cultural surroundings. Our source talks about becoming. It's not just moving house, it's a deep personal change.
It's interesting how that contrasts with de Mott's poem mentioned in the source. Kozane's experience seems to anchor him to both his origin and his journey, making the starting point almost like an exile.
Exactly. A different sense of place and time compared to the fluidity in the poem. It gives weight to both the place left behind and the path taken.
These personal accounts are so powerful. Now, thinking about these individual journeys, let's look at how traditions themselves cope in our, well, very globalized world. The source mentions this tension between modernizers and traditionalists.
Yeah, as communities get influenced by bigger systems, you often see this struggle. And there's a genuine risk, the source points out, of cultural traditions getting watered down.
Right. This idea of picking and choosing the best parts from other cultures sounds appealing, maybe creating new hybrid cultures. But it also makes traditions seem quite fragile, doesn't it?
It really does. This constant mixing can create a sense that unique cultural ways are under threat, leading to this desire to protect heritage.
Which brings us to this concept of transcultural heritage. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. It basically means cultural elements that have developed through interaction between different groups over time. They kind of blur the old boundaries.
Okay.
And with technology making it easy to share local practices globally, questions pop up. Like, what's the value of something when it's taken out of its original context?
Yeah.
And who really owns it?
Ah, the ownership question.
Mm-hmm.
That gets complicated fast, especially when, as the source says, different places might claim to be the origin of something found far away.
Exactly. And grouping different local things under one label implies shared histories across borders, which further complicates that idea of ownership.
This whole process of exchange and adaptation, we see it with students studying abroad too, right?
We do. The Force explains they tend to hold on to parts of their home culture, but also have to adapt to new ways in the host country. And interestingly, when they go back home, they might see their own culture differently.
Because they've integrated these new perspectives, so adaptation isn't just a one-off thing.
Not at all. It's an ongoing journey, constantly evolving.
And technology just accelerates all this exchange, doesn't it? The source sees computing tech as the latest tool, like writing or printing, making culture more accessible.
Right. And the interesting idea here is that as these tools become more common and complex, they might actually help prevent cultures from fragmenting.
Okay, hang on. That seems counterintuitive. With online bubbles and everything, how does more access lead to less division?
Well, the argument is that networking cultural creators and making products more accessible can lead to a richer, more dynamic culture overall. Easier sharing, more creativity.
Okay. I see the potential for richness.
But there's a flip side. The source also warns that the ease of editing and reproducing culture might make things less permanent. And maybe we become less active consumers, less engaged in seeking things out.
Right. So convenience has its downsides too. With all this going on, preserving heritage feels even more critical.
Absolutely. The source really emphasizes protecting diverse heritages that go beyond borders. It's key for understanding, creativity, fighting discrimination. But it also notes that real-world inequalities can undermine these efforts.
And preserving this transcultural heritage is tricky, vulnerable.
Very. It makes us question what we preserve and why. Intangible heritage traditions, practices, is especially fragile. Accidents, neglect, even deliberate subversion can threaten it.
Which is where that idea of globalization comes in.
Exactly. It's about larger communities needing the political will to support their unique, local, global heritage against purely global pressures.
But even trying to preserve things can have unintended effects. Like, making official records might disconnect the practice from its living meaning.
Yeah, it can sometimes flatten things out, maybe impose a political interpretation. It raises the question, what essence of the immaterial actually survives when we try to capture and display heritage?
It's a deep question. Okay, let's shift gears to something maybe a bit more tangible, but just as cultural. Food.
Well, yes. The source argues that even just talking is cultural, a step towards creating culture. And in our diverse world, supporting different cultures living side by side pluralism is fundamental.
Makes sense. And food practices, the source says, are often these vital bridges, especially in mixed heritage homes.
Totally. Think about food-related objects, a special dish, a recipe book. They can connect people and places across time, holding really powerful cultural memories.
And people use food actively, don't they, to build hybrid identities, creating a kind of third space between cultures.
Exactly. It reminds us food isn't just fuel, it's packed with cultural meaning, history, intention.
And looking broader, a community's whole attitude towards food shapes its customs, its culture. Food is almost universal, right? Central to gatherings, sometimes even political moments.
Absolutely. Understanding how a society views food is pretty fundamental to understanding the society itself. Culture, as the source defines it, is this whole system of meanings, perceptions, values, symbols, and foods right in the middle of that.
It's not just about the fancy traditional stuff either. Food fusion is happening everywhere, even in local diners, right? Crossing food frontiers.
Yeah, it reflects that constant interaction between cultures. It's not treating cultures as these fixed, separate things.
And the source contrasts these local places doing fusion with more standardized chains focusing on quote-unquote authenticity.
Right. It shows how globalization has shifted, how we even think about national cuisines. It's not just about ethnicity or high-end cooking anymore.
And there are generational differences too. Older folks preferring traditional, younger ones more open to mixing things up.
Often, yeah. Younger generations may be influenced more by travel, migration, mainstream trends, drive this culinary crossing. It's linked to that transnational flow of people and ideas.
And we see this celebrated in food festivals. The source mentions Athens, Amsterdam, Buenos Aires.
Yeah, great examples. Athens focusing on Greek gastronomy, farm to table. Amsterdam with Michelin chefs in open-air settings, using canals. Buenos Aires showcasing wine and food trends across the city.
Sounds amazing. They're not just about eating, are they? They're celebrating identity, innovation through food.
Exactly. Vibrant examples of cultural exchange and evolving traditions.
Okay, so from food, let's move to another cornerstone. Language and communication.
Absolutely central. Language, as the source stresses, is a huge part of cultural identity. It's how cultural patterns get passed down. And crucially, one language can hold multiple cultures, and one culture can have multiple languages.
Right. And it's not just the words, is it? It's the subtle ways we use language that signal social ties, cultural identities. The source mentions Japanese history as an example.
Yeah, briefly.
Yeah.
How it's this mix of elements, adopting kanji, developing hiragana and katakana, borrowing from other languages. It shows that history of exchange.
And mastering it is hard because of sounds, different social styles.
Apparently so. Nuances in sound change, meaning different styles tied to background, plus it's idiomatic, and things like honorifics are tricky for outsiders. It really highlights how deeply language and cultural subtleties are linked.
And those subtleties can lead to language barriers.
Definitely. The source explains language shapes thought and action through, well, four things: vocabulary, accent, grammar, and pragmatics, how we use language socially.
So a barrier isn't just not knowing words, it's misunderstanding terms, lacking context.
Exactly. And these barriers come from differences in fluency, education, politeness, norms, cultural background, all sorts of factors.
And the results can range from like a typo to major miscommunications.
Potentially, yes. The example of the student misunderstanding a question about their culture, or locals using idioms that make them uncomfortable. It shows how easily it can happen in everyday situations.
But on the flip side, there's bilingualism and multilingualism.
Right, using two or more languages. Sociolinguistics helps us study this in its social context. And there's a difference, the source notes, between just knowing some of the second language and being truly fluent into a balanced bilingual.
And language choice in bilingual communities isn't random. It's influenced by social status, economics.
Often, yes. And then you have concepts like diglossia, where two forms of the same language are used for different things, sometimes politically imposed. It's complex.
But being bilingual or multilingual lets you navigate between these different worlds linguistically and culturally.
Precisely, which is increasingly vital. And this ties into the impact of global English. The source says the 21st century is, well, unprecedented for English as an international language, EIL.
There's been a shift in teaching, right? Moving away from just focusing on native speakers.
Yeah, towards seeing English as a language for everyone, a common tongue, often used between non-native speakers. The expanding circle, they call it.
But it's crucial to look beyond those native speaker models.
Yes, though the source warns that even including other voices might accidentally reinforce existing power structures if we're not careful.
Hmm. So the suggestion is to fundamentally rethink English, free it from Western dominance, challenge cultural hierarchies.
That's the argument, to deconstruct those embedded differences.
Okay. Let's turn now to customs and rituals, deeply cultural expressions.
Very much so. The source notes people everywhere have arts, crafts reflecting their lives, but ceremonies are often hugely significant. These formal acts, sometimes religious, express group identity, values.
And the language used is often poetic, hard to translate.
Often, yes. Which underlines why good translation matters. The stuff collected around ceremony, social history, folklore, moral views, even satire and myths tells us so much.
And practices can vary even within the same community. Not participating can cause friction.
It can. Data shows similarities in timing and style, but the details often differ. Non-observance can definitely cause resentment sometimes.
Related to this are celebrations and festivals. They seem really important for community identity today.
Especially in a globalized world, yes. They often revive traditions in modern ways, emphasizing local uniqueness.
The source describes them as dynamic gatherings, bringing together people, food, buildings, rituals.
Everything.
Yeah.
Iconic figures, sensory experiences, the whole atmosphere. They create community through shared bodily sensations, but they can also separate participants from outsiders.
So festivals are like mini cultural crossroads themselves, where place, tradition, authenticity, globalization all meet.
Exactly. They're real-time polycultural celebrations, a hybrid mix of global and local, reflecting the community, its economy, its concerns.
And then there are rites of passage, marking life transitions.
Right. The source mentions adolescence specifically, witnessing transformations like boys becoming men in some cultures. Often there's more social support emphasis for males, more self-focus for females during these times.
But these rites provide a kind of map for navigating adolescence, strengthening identity even now?
They can, yeah. The source references Arnold van Gennep's classic idea: separation, the in-between stage, margin, and reintegration. Rituals marking changes.
They create order, give social meaning to biological changes.
Precisely. And while we often link the term to big things like marriage or death, that three-part structure applies to many transitions.
Then there are the everyday customs, things we might not even notice. Greetings, for instance.
Can be really elaborate, right? Conveying blessings, asking after health, different gestures too, joining hands, bowing, taking off hats.
And using titles shows politeness. Dining to so many rules. Seating, utensils, when to finish.
But it's interesting, the source notes similar underlying ideas about food across cultures. Suggests some universal beliefs, perhaps.
Speaking of universals, what about common values? The source says it's hard to pin down, but sees similarities.
It does. Things like belief in a creator, common ancestry, earning wealth justly, treating hardship fairly, inherent equality. These seem to pop up in various forms.
And ideals like social justice, rule of law being essential for self-government.
Yeah, those are highlighted globally.
Yeah.
Defining the people, understanding statehood core concepts, even if details vary. Popular sovereignty gets articulated similarly worldwide.
And the idea of community being fundamental, shaping laws around equality and justice.
Right. Anthropology shows this belief in community is incredibly resilient across time and place.
But despite these common threads, the source also expresses concern about growing divisions, economic gaps, theological differences, power struggles.
Yeah, since the 80s, ironically happening alongside communication breakthroughs, a sense of fragmentation, balkanization, even as the planet feels smaller.
A loss of shared experience, joy, grief, getting lost in the information flood.
That's the lament. How do we navigate this crossroads of, the immediate versus the long-lasting?
Yeah.
The source uses the metaphor of an ever-changing city.
Right. And this brings us to the tough topic of cultural divisions and conflict.
Yeah. In deeply divided cultures, the source notes writers or observers can become targets. Intense battles leave no middle ground.
Writing with integrity takes courage, but maybe it's more idealistic than practical sometimes.
That's the suggestion. And there's a critique of focusing only on surface issues, missing the deeper clash of cultures of fundamental beliefs developed over centuries.
A war of cultures, really. And the source criticizes writers who ignore divisions at home but fiercely attack them elsewhere.
Yes, calls it a shortcoming of perception, particularly when Western intellectual history is maybe used inappropriately against native philosophies.
And these different perspectives inevitably lead to misunderstandings. The source gives examples.
Several. Like A French speaker's observations might seem fragmented to an Anglo observer expecting a linear argument.
Mm.
One sees poor thinking, the other sees a failure to engage properly.
Different communication styles, different expectations.
Exactly. The English, historically seen as detached, maybe leading to interpretations like devious.
Hmm.
Asian listeners finding English storytelling halting.
And the reverse, English speakers seeing Italians as wishy-washy, while Italians see their interruptions as adding energy.
Right. Different norms about directness, turn-taking, goal orientation in conversation. It varies hugely.
And these misunderstandings often get amplified by stereotypes and prejudice.
Big time. Stereotypes create barriers, the source explains, because we act on generalizations instead of seeing the individual, thinking all A's are B's.
Putting people in boxes based on limited markers. The source mentions an anecdote about jokes.
Yeah, a Hong Kong citizen and a Mongolian sharing jokes but disagreeing if they were actually insulting shows how differently generalizations land. The advice is to try and understand the individual's actual beliefs. Challenging though that is.
Instead of assuming based on where they're from, the source also mentions how beliefs spread, early imprinting, shared priorities.
Right, but it warns against forcing beliefs on others. That often leads to resistance if there's no internal acceptance.
Okay, so looking forward, what's the future of these cultural interactions? Divisions persist despite globalization, right? Concerns about homogenization.
Definitely. Scholars disagree. Some see sameness coming, others see a clash of civilizations.
The source makes 3 key points about the future.
Yes. First, inequalities from globalization can cause friction between different worldviews, pre-modern, first world, hypermodern, could lead to conflict or maybe cultural renewal.
Okay.
Cross-cultural understanding needs knowledge, sensitivity. Just focusing on history or communication habits might miss the potential of multicultural life. Future work should look at identity negotiation and communication.
And third.
Beyond just, better marketing, we need to study how mass media shapes our view of local, regional, national, global realities, how the us versus them dynamic develops. The Euro 2000 football example shows how media framed regional boundaries.
Interesting. This leads into emerging cultural trends. The source mentions shifts in the West since the 60s, post-Christianity, postmodern ideas.
Yeah. Cultural relativism, sexual liberation, death of God ideas, neo-Marxist influences, plus globalization's impact via corporations, the internet, cultural domination concerns.
And these trends affect different fields like religion and anthropology.
Right. Some reject faith or anthropology, others adapt. The source suggests modernity, while born from Christendom, ironically paved the way for postmodern shifts by prioritizing reason over mystery.
Leading to a kind of profane disequilibrium, fears and uncertainties.
That's the phrase used. Increased curiosity and commodification fueling anxieties rather than the promised divine victory of modernity.
Amidst all this, the idea of global citizenship emerges.
Yes, a sense of universal belonging, often driven by a desire to escape oppression, create a more just world. We see global citizens emerging, networks forming a kind of global civil society.
Acting in solidarity across borders.
Exactly. But the source notes we're still figuring out how to educate for global citizenship effectively. It means understanding interconnectedness, committing to the collective good beyond just local or national ties.
Thinking about planetary rights and obligations, maybe? It offers new ways to look at migration, borders, and equality.
It does. And finally, the source looks at case studies of cultural integration, towns facing change, needing to integrate local and migrant cultures.
And integration doesn't mean becoming the same, right?
Not at all. The other culture might be very different. How the alien becomes normalized varies, often involves power dynamics. Cultural differences are deep-rooted in things like family structures, self-image.
Yeah.
They persist.
So newcomers need freedom to express their culture, to feel they belong.
That's crucial. But the source also cautions that if multiculturalism just leads to isolated groups, that's not really integration either. And forcing integration based on rigid norms is problematic.
Well, so more freedom, more flexibility in daily interactions might lead to smoother integration, like in Palermo.
That's the suggestion. On the other hand, we also see successful integration. Globalization means more mobility, so successful integration is vital. It can benefit everyone through mutual learning, exchange.
Studies in places like Berlin and Bologna show this. Heterogeneous groups working together.
Yeah, like Chinese shop owners and Italians in Bologna finding coexistence, increasing social knowledge, maybe even formal equality. Success involved mutual knowledge, exchange, shared norms growing over time.
But there are also major challenges. The source gives examples.
2 stark ones. Oak Flat, Arizona's sacred Apache land threatened by mining. an activist trying to bridge worldviews, facing challenges like Apache bans on certain tech, but fighting to preserve the sacred.
A real clash of values and economies.
And the other is the Muslim community in Europe facing rising online hate, especially since the War on Terror. Violent acts, hate speech, undermining representation. State seen as slow to react to Islamophobia.
And the pandemic amplifying conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
Radicalization.
Yes. New actors exploiting anxieties, even former athletes recruiting, really worrying trends.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the main takeaway seems to be that these cultural crossroads are incredibly dynamic. Spaces of meeting, diverging, constantly shaped by personal lives, global forces, negotiating identity.
Absolutely. And understanding them is just crucial in our interconnected world. It's not simple. It's always evolving.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener. Given all these examples, the personal struggles, the global challenges of integration, preserving heritage, how can you, in your own life, contribute to more meaningful engagement at the cultural crossroads you encounter?
Yeah, what small, maybe, but significant actions can help bridge divides, foster real connection in this complex cultural landscape we all navigate.
Something to reflect on. We really encourage you to think about your own experiences and maybe explore these topics further.